Self-knowledge.
Quote,
In most living creatures, ignorance of self is nature. In humanity, it is vice. Boethius.
end quote.
Vice may be defined as a course of behaviour consented to by the will, and having results which are bad, primarily because they are force eclipsing, and secondarily because they are physically or psychologically harmful to the agent or its fellows. Ignorance of self is something that answers to the description of vice. In its origins, ignorance of self is voluntary, for by introspection and by listening to other people's judgments of our character, we can all, if we so desire, come to a very shrewd understanding of our flaws and weaknesses and the real, as opposed to the avowed and advertised, motives for our actions. If most of us remain ignorant of ourselves, it is because self-knowledge is painful and we prefer the pleasures of illusion. As for the consequences of such ignorance, these are bad by every criterion, from the utilitarian to the transcendental. Bad because self-ignorance leads to unrealistic behaviour, and so causes every kind of trouble for everyone concerned. And bad because without self-knowledge there can be no true humility, and therefore no effective self-naughting, and therefore no unitive knowledge of the force underlying the self, otherwise ordinarily eclipsed by it. The importance, the indispensable necessity of self-knowledge has been stressed by the saints and doctors of every one of the great religious traditions. To us in the West, the most familiar voice is that of Socrates. More systematically than Socrates, the Indian Jedi harped on the same theme. There is, for example, the Buddha, whose discourse on setting up of mindfulness, with that positively inexorable exhaustiveness characteristic of the Pali scriptures, the whole art of self-knowledge in all its branches, knowledge of one's body, one's senses, one's feelings, and one's thoughts. This art of self-knowledge is practiced with two aims. The proximate aim is that consciousness of the body remains ardent, self-possessed, and mindful in order to overcome both the hankering and dejection common in the world. And in the same way, consciousness of feelings, thoughts, and ideas remains ardent, self-possessed, and mindful, without hankering or dejection. Beyond and through this desirable psychological condition lies the final end of humanity, knowledge of that which underlies the individualized self. In their own vocabulary, Christian writers express the same ideas.
Quote,
A person has many skins in themselves, covering the depths of their heart. A person knows so many things, yet they do not know themselves. Indeed, 30 or 40 skins or hides, just like an ox's or a bear's, so thick and hard, cover the psyche. Go into your own essence and learn how to know yourself there. Eckhart. Fools regard themselves as awake now, so personal is their knowledge. It may be as a prince, or it may be as a herdsman, but they are so cocksure themselves. Chuang Tzu.
end quote.
This metaphor of waking from dreams recurs again and again in the various expositions of the perennial philosophy of the Jedi. In this context, liberation might be defined as the process of waking up out of the nonsense, nightmares, and illusory pleasures of what is ordinarily called real life into the awareness of eternity. The sober certainty of waking bliss, that wonderful phrase in which Milton described the experience of the noblest kind of music, comes, I suppose, about as near as words can get to enlightenment and deliverance.
Quote,
You are that which is not. I am that I am. If you perceive this truth in your deepest being, never shall the enemy deceive you. you shall escape all their snares. St. Catherine of Siena. Knowledge of ourselves teaches us from where we have come, where we are, and where we are going. We come from the Force, and we are now in exile, and it is because the potency of our affections tend toward the Force that we are aware of this state of exile. Roysbrook.
End quote.
Spiritual progress is through the growing knowledge of the self as nothing, and of the unmanifest force as all-embracing reality. Such knowledge, of course, is worthless if it is merely theoretical. To be effective, it must be realized as an immediate, intuitive experience and appropriately acted upon. Of one great master of the spiritual life, Professor Etienne Gilson, writes, "The displacement of fear by charity, by way of the practice of humility, in that consists the whole of St. Bernard's discipline, its beginning, its development, and its term. Fear, worry, anxiety, these form the central core of individualized selfhood. Fear cannot be got rid of by personal effort, but only by the ego's absorption in a cause greater than its own interests. Absorption in any cause will rid the mind of some of its fears, but only absorption in the loving and knowing of the force can rid it of all pervasive fear. For when the cause is less than the highest, the sense of fear and anxiety is transferred from the self to the cause, as when heroic self-sacrifice for a loved individual or institution is accompanied by anxiety in regard to that for which the sacrifice is made. Whereas, if the sacrifice is made for the force and for others for the sake of the force, there can be no fear and abiding anxiety, since nothing can be a menace to the force, and even failure and disaster are to be accepted as being in accord with its divine will. In few men and women is trust in the force intense enough to cast out this projected fear and anxiety for cherished persons and institutions. The reason is to be sought in the fact that few men and women are humble enough to be capable of trusting as they should, and they lack the necessary humility because they are without the fully realized knowledge of their own personal nothingness.
Quote.
Humility does not consist in hiding our talents and virtues, in thinking ourselves worse and more ordinary than we are, but in possessing a clear knowledge of all that is lacking in us, and in not exalting ourselves for that which we have been gifted, understanding that the Force has freely given everything to us, and that, despite all its gifts, we are still of infinitely little importance. Lacordaire. As the light of the Force grows in us, we see ourselves to be worse than we previously thought. We are amazed at our form of blindness as we experience a whole swarm of shameful feelings emerging, like filthy reptiles crawling from a hidden cave. But we should be neither amazed nor disturbed. We are not worse than we were. On the contrary, we are better. But while our faults diminish, the light we see them by waxes brighter, and we are filled with horror. So long as there is no sign of cure, we are unaware of the depth of our disease. We are in a state of blind presumption and hardness, the prey of self-delusion. While we go with the stream, we are unconscious of its rapid course, but when we begin to stem it ever so little, the current makes itself felt. Perennial. My daughter, build yourself 2 cells. First, a real cell, so that you do not run about much and talk, unless it is needful or required out of love for your neighbor. Next, build yourself a spiritual cell, which you will always take with you. That will be the cell of true self-knowledge. You will find in there the knowledge of the Force in you. Here, there are really 2 cells in one, and if you live in one, you will also live in the other. Otherwise, the psyche will either despair or be presumptuous. If you dwelt in self-knowledge alone, you would despair. If you dealt in the knowledge of the Force alone, you would be tempted to presumption. One must go with the other, and thus you will reach perfection. St. Catherine of Siena.
End quote.